Matthew chapter 19.
Well, right. I know.
Believe it or not, 19.
Not right now.
Well,
Bill says we've only been in Matthew for 2 years, so we got to stretch this out a little bit.
It's 2 years, the 24th of January.
Wow.
You can hear it.
Is it too loud up there?
It is when it's right here.
They really don't want to hear me back there. All right, Matthew chapter 19. So we have a thrilling section to go through here on divorce and remarriage. So I know you'll be excited about that. So we do have this serious section, and you all know, I don't have to tell you, right, that divorce has become an epidemic really in this country. It's become normalized. It's expected that people will not continue in their marriage. So it's a pretty important chapter that we understand God's perspective on all this. We have the country really just has completely lowered its standard on marriage and on and divorce, and so we've got to look at and see what God says. So let's begin in chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. First of all, to get the context of where we are. It says, "Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these sayings that he departed from Galilee and came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan, and a great multitude followed him, and he healed them there." So here we have Jesus who has finished the sayings that we had in chapter 18. Again, remember, this was, we talked about thinking about Christians as children, how they come into the kingdom as children, how we should treat them as children, how we should discipline them as children, how we should forgive them as children. We've been over that for the last several weeks. So after these sayings, he really departs Galilee. So this is really marks the end of his Galilean ministry, his time in Galilee. What's interesting is really between chapter 18 and chapter 19, there's a whole section of time that is not included in Matthew. You can find it in Luke. But he does take another trip up to Jerusalem through Samaria that is not recorded in Matthew. What we have here in Matthew, beginning in chapter 19, is his final journey up to Jerusalem, which really ends with his triumphal entry in chapter 21, and then all the events that follow after that. So we have this time in chapters 19 and 20, where it says, if you see there, it came to the region of Judea beyond the Jordan. So he's now east of the Jordan. We think of it a lot as the desert area of the country. But at this point in time during Jesus' ministry, it is highly populated with Jews. It is a Jewish country here in the area that's called Perea. And so this is really the beginning of his Perean ministry, if you will, in chapters 19 and 20. But again, he is headed to Jerusalem. This is the closing of his ministry, if you will, here in Perea as he ministers to the Jews that are there. He does, as it says here, there's healing that goes on in verse 2. In Mark, it says that he also taught them. So it's a very similar ministry to what he's done in Galilee, teaching and healing. But now it's in this new area with new people here in Perea. The other thing I'll just mention here, and we'll bring up later, is that this area is also where Herod Antipas ruled. Herod Antipas, if you remember, was the one who had the interaction with John the Baptist, and we're going to come back to that in just a few minutes, but that's the area that he's in. All right, so let's go on to the teaching beginning really in verse 3. It says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?'" So here we have the Pharisees again. They're dogging Jesus, right? They're following him around during his ministry. And he is, so again, they're trying to test him, trying to attack him, if you will. In this particular case, they're trying to discredit him with this question. This question is not something they just thought up in the moment. This is something they've thought about. Let's ask this question because we want a particular reaction. And the thing you need to know is that during this time, the Jews actually were split in their understanding about divorce. There were those scribes and Pharisees and teachers, rabbis who taught that the only reason you could have a divorce is for adultery. And then there were those who would teach that, no, you can have a divorce for any reason of uncleanness, which could be that your wife has burnt supper, or she didn't wear her hair right that day, or maybe there was somebody who was prettier that you found. All of those could be reasons. Now, this was not a 50-50 split in the rabbis. It was more like a 90-10, where most of the rabbis believed that you could divorce for any reason. And there was only a few that actually thought that it was much more restricted. And so they're bringing this question to Jesus. And of course, the people loved the rabbis who thought, hey, I can get rid of my wife for any reason, right? They thought those were the ones that were popular. And so, most of the people were on that side of the gamut. And so when they ask him this question, their real intent here is to get the people to turn against him, right? He's trying to raise an issue that was going to get the people to say, oh, well, we don't want to follow this guy if he believes that. Now, I will say that this is not, they know what Jesus's position is, right? So if you go turn for a minute back to chapter 5, Jesus has already addressed this issue for us in chapter 5. By the way, I have a new Bible for my birthday, because my other one was falling apart. And so it will take me a little longer to find out where chapter 5 is. All right. Yeah, but it's just not in the same place. All right. In Matthew chapter 5, look at verse 31 and 32. Here again, where he was talking about the difference between what the Pharisees believed and what he believed. In Matthew 5:31, it says, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. So Jesus, with that statement back in chapter 5, is certainly aligning himself with the 10% of the rabbis who thought that the divorce was restricted to only adultery. So again, they knew his position. They wanted to drive people away from him, show that he was a hardliner, right? And also that he didn't follow most of the rabbis, right? He wasn't listening to them. He was pushing back against what the popular rabbis believe. And there was one other reason that they would bring up this question, and it was what I referred to earlier, and that is that this is, again, where Herod Antipas ruled. And if you remember why John the Baptist got in trouble, it's because he pointed out the adultery that Herod Antipas was involved in, right? When he married his brother's wife and cousin and et cetera, all that stuff that we went through back there when we talked about John the Baptist. So you could see that the Pharisees are also raising this issue because they would love for Herod to come down on Jesus, right, and kill Jesus. They wanted him dead. We've already seen that, and so this was an ideal question to raise this issue, hopefully get Herod fired up, and maybe take care of Jesus for them. So this was not, they were not trying to get information here, right? They were trying to get Jesus in trouble in one way or another. All right, so then let's look at Jesus' response in verses 4 through 6. It says, and he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So the first thing you got to see here is the sarcasm in verse 4, right? Have you not read? Right? He's addressing the Pharisees here who were, all about the, their knowledge and how smart they were, and he's just saying, well, gee, guys, haven't you even read what God had to say about this? Right? Have you not even read how God, came down on this issue? So it's a real smack in the face to the Pharisees that he begins it this way. And then what we have here is 4 reasons why Jesus says you should not divorce, right? The first one here in verse 4, he made them in the beginning, he made them male and female. Okay, this comes from Genesis 1:27. We don't need to go back there right now, but in Genesis 1:27, right, God creates them and he creates them male and female. If you also look at Genesis 2:4, you remember it says the two become one flesh, right? Which he quotes a little bit later, the two become one flesh. The point here is that he created male and female. God did that, right? God creates male, God creates female. With today's issues that are going on, that's not insignificant that God creates male and creates female. But in particular here, he creates one male and he creates one female, right? The two of them become one flesh. There's no spares when God creates a male and female, right? He doesn't create male and a bunch of females. He creates male and female. Adam doesn't have any other options with regard to who his wife is going to be. Eve does not have any options, right? It's the two of them. The two become one flesh. One of the commentaries said, if Adam had decided to divorce his wife, the Bible would have stopped at Genesis chapter 1, right? There's no more story, right? I mean, the two become one flesh, become the foundation of everything that that follows, really. So the first reason to not divorce is because God created a relationship. God created this commitment between a man and a woman for life, and that's the way that he designed it, right? So the first reason for not divorce is God created one man, one woman for life. That was the original plan, right? Secondly, in verse 5, it says, and for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So this word joined, some viewers may say cleaved to his wife. An even better translation is glued. That's the best word for what we see there in the Hebrew, is they're glued together. They're stuck with an unbreakable bond. They're consecrated to one another. There's nothing that can separate them in God's eyes. They're completely cleaved, joined together. So that's the second reason, right? Because of this unbreakable bond that God has given them in marriage, there should not be divorce. And then the third reason also in that verse is it says the two became one flesh, right? The two became one flesh. And he repeats it in verse 6. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. This is how God views us after marriage. This is really an important thing. God views us after marriage as one flesh. The two become one. When he looks down upon us, he sees one, not two. When he looks down upon your ministry, he sees one ministry between the two of you, not two ministries, right? When so just take Joe and I, for example, right? So I teach this class, but when God looks down, he sees Joe and I, our ministry is to teach this class, right? I can't do this without Joe, right? I mean, it's impossible to have the time to study, to have this, to have the interaction with you guys. She's the one in the background saying, don't say that stupid thing, right? I mean, without Joe, this ministry doesn't happen, right? I mean, and when God looks down, he sees one ministry, right? When Joe interacts with the ladies that she interacts with and ministers to them, it's me and her ministering to them, right? It's not just her. So I just, so the other part of that is when I mess up, it also gets reflected on Joe, right? When I sin, God sees us sinning. That's a big weight. That I don't want to mess up her. But when God sees me, he sees us. God sees one. I just want you to get that. God sees one when he sees us. God sees us together. That it just really hit me strong this week, and it means something. It means more than just this idea around marriage. It means something with regard to how I treat her, right? When I treat her poorly, I'm treating myself poorly, right? When I don't respect her, I'm not respecting myself. All of that stuff is wrapped in together. The other part of that is I've showed that picture before of, the world's picture of marriage is two people holding hands, right? And so to get a divorce, the only thing you got to do is break apart those two hands. But God's picture of marriage is one person. And so when you divorce, you got to cleave one person in half in order to make a divorce happen. So this picture of two becoming one is to me really, really a powerful picture. All right, and then the fourth one, so let's repeat. So the first one is he created one man, one woman for life. The second thing is he glued us and bound us, bound us together. And the third is that we become one flesh. The fourth, in verse 6, it says, so then we are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but you got to remember that this is God that did it. This is God joining two people together. God makes a marriage. God puts people together. Now, what's interesting about this one is there are people that use this as an excuse for divorce, right? They say, well, obviously God didn't put us together, right? There's no way God could have done that. And so therefore, we can get a divorce because God didn't put us together. If God had put us together, then certainly, we would stay together, but God certainly didn't put us together. But that is absolutely taking this verse and making it the opposite of what it's saying, because what it is saying is that God has joined together those who are married. He defines marriage. He sets up marriage. And so when two people are brought together in marriage, that's God bringing them together. It's not the other way around. God brings them together. There would not be a marriage unless God brought them together. Whether this is Christians or pagans or whomever, when there is a marriage, that's God's design for those two people to be together. It's not how we view it, it's how God views it. Let me just pause there. Are you okay with everything I've said so far? So this is why not to divorce, right? One man, one woman for life, glued together. The two become one. And frankly, it's God's decision and it's God's marriage, which may be the strongest of all four of those things. Just pausing to see if there's any pushback.
Does this only apply to Christians?
No.
The world has abused marriage beyond all believe.
Absolutely. What, we're going to get into a little bit, what is marriage, but marriage really is the commitment of a man and a woman together for life, right? And if you make that commitment in front of God, you're married, right? You're married if you make that commitment. And so yes, this applies to pagans and Christians and non-Christians. Let's keep going because the questions will give us more as we'll get more questions as we get into this. So let me just say this, that the whole Old Testament supports this position. Certainly the New Testament supports this position. I do want to show you, go back to Malachi, just a couple of important verses right there in Malachi. And it's easy to find. Malachi chapter 2. Malachi 2, verse 13. Says, and this is the second thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and crying, so he does not regard the offering anymore, nor receive it with goodwill from your hands. So he's saying here, you're bringing an offering to God, but the altar is covered with tears, with weeping and crying. So go on, verse 14. And yet you say, for what reason? Why is this happening? Because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously. Yet she is your companion and your wife by covenant, right? Your wife by covenant. Verse 15, but did he not make them one, having a remnant of the Spirit? And why one? He seeks godly offspring. Therefore, take heed to your spirit, and let none deal treacherously with the wife of your youth. For the Lord God of Israel says that he hates divorce, for it covers one's garments with violence, says the Lord of hosts. Therefore, take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. And he's saying there, deal treacherously with your wife. So again, he's saying, your wife is coming to me in weeping and crying, and therefore what you're bringing to the table, your offering to the Lord, is of no account because you've dealt treacherously with your wife. And he makes this very sharp statement that he hates divorce. Okay, so the point of Jesus making these statements here in 4, 5, and 6 is to lay out this was God's plan. Okay, this is God's perfect plan. This is what God desires. He desires one woman, one man for life. They're bonded together. The two become one, and that is something that he has created and instituted. All right. Now, let's go on to verse 7. And they said to him, why then, this is again the Pharisees, they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? Right? So first of all, you got to realize the Pharisees have completely ignored everything that Jesus is saying, right? They don't come back to, well, let's get clarity on what God said. Let's get clarity on what it really means to have a marriage. They don't care. They don't care what the divine instruction is. They don't care what the divine ideal is. They're just looking for the exceptions, right? They're looking for, how do I get out of it? And this is the Pharisees over and over and over again, right? They're always looking for, how do I get out of God's law? How do I sneak past it? What's the way, that I don't have to be obedient? And this is why they constantly are, going back to chapter 5 again. This is constantly why Jesus was saying, but this is what the scripture really says. It really says this, not the way that you have falsely interpreted it so that you can get out of it. And he's saying the same thing here. They're trying, the Pharisees are trying to pit Jesus against Moses here, right? Again, trying to discredit him, saying, well, Moses said this and you're saying that, blah, 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 blah. So we have to actually go back and look what Moses had to say. So I want you to actually turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 24, to the passage that the Pharisees are referring to. And let's look at it, because in all honesty, they get it completely wrong. Deuteronomy See, I can't find it. I know it's in this Bible somewhere. Deuteronomy chapter 24. And let's look at this passage. The passage is a little bit clumsy, and so we need to make sure we understand what it is saying. So in my Bible, it's titled The Law Concerning Divorce, which is a mistitle. But let's get into it and see what it has to say. So Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of the house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her as his wife, then the former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled, for it is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So first of all, we got to deal with this word in verse 1. He has found some uncleanness in him, in her, excuse me. He has found some uncleanness in her. Another translation says some indecency. Now, the thing that you need to see here, he has found something in her that's unclean, indecent. She's done something wrong. She's done something bad. We don't know exactly what it is, but one thing it is not is adultery. If it had been adultery, they would have said adultery, because adultery is all over the Old Testament, as you know. And if it had been adultery at this point in the Old Testament, what is the punishment for adultery? It's death, right? It's death. So we have some kind of uncleanness, some kind of indecency that this woman has done, but it is short of adultery. Now, it may very well be that she is, because it says in the very next verse, right, that she goes off and marries some other man. It may very well be that she is in some kind of flirtatious relationship with someone else, but it's not adultery. Okay, so she does not find favor in his eyes. He's found some uncleanness. He writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, sends her out of the house. Right? When she is departed from his house, he goes and marries. She goes and marries another man's. I'm sorry. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, right? She goes and marries another man. Now, this passage does not say, notice what it does not say. It does not say that this man should go and write this certificate of divorce. It doesn't advocate it. It doesn't command it. It doesn't condone it. It just says that it happens, right? He has found some uncleanness. He has found some indecency, and he writes her this certificate of divorce. And then she goes and remarries someone else. And then if you look down at verse 3, if the latter husband detests her, so she's now in the second relationship, this person writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, sends her out of the house, or the latter husband dies, either way. Then verse 4, then her former husband, right, the first husband now, wants to remarry her. And this says he must not take her back. He cannot divorce her because she has been defiled. Now the question is, why has she been defiled?
Now been with another man.
Okay. And why? So she gets a certificate of divorce. So why is that not enough? Why are you saying that she could not remarry, CT?
That's man's certificate of divorce. It's not God's.
So are you saying she could not remarry?
No.
Aren't they still one flesh?
They're
The
one
first-
flesh.
Yeah, so this is the key. This section here, in verses 1 through 4, is no kinds of commands relative to divorce. It is a command relative to remarriage. Okay, it's saying you should not remarry an illegitimately divorced person, right? This woman has been divorced by her husband and then has remarried and should not have remarried. Okay? She has been illegitimately divorced from her husband because there was no adultery in the first relationship. Right? Am I getting you confused or you got it? You got it?
Got it.
Joe got it. So I'm assuming the rest of you got it.
I got it.
Right? All right. So this is important background as we get back into Matthew. The point is, this verse is about you cannot remarry an illegitimately divorced person. That is the point of this passage. That's the message that he's trying to get back to. Now let's go back to Matthew. All right, so they bring up in verse 7, why then did Moses command a certificate of divorce and put her away? Jesus responds in verse 8, he said, Moses, because of the hardness of your heart, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Right? First of all, Moses did not command anywhere. By the way, do you know where the passage is in the Old Testament where Moses commands people to get a divorce? No, you don't, because there's not one. Okay, there's no passage in the Old Testament where Moses commands people to get a divorce. There is not such a thing. So they're relying on this one. They've interpreted this uncleanness, this indecency, as again a reason for why you can get a divorce because that happened. But God's just saying, no, the only reason that we even give any kind of certificate of divorce is because of the hardness of your heart, permitting you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so, right? It was not so from the beginning. What's interesting is we also say here that, as I said when we were looking at Deuteronomy, in the beginning, the penalty to divorce was death, right? That was very clearly stated in several places in the Old Testament. What's interesting is over time, however, you see God's grace stepping in when there is adultery, right? Because famous characters in the Old Testament, like our good friend David, right? Committed adultery. He did not die, right? Because of God's grace, he did not die. We see Solomon, who had a whole harem full of adultery, right? And he did not die because of that. So we see this transition from killing to grace around adultery. Now, let's go on to verse 9 to pull in the whole rest of it here. So verse 9 says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So one question I didn't ask you when we were back in Deuteronomy, the woman who her husband divorces her because of some uncleanness, right? What has she done something wrong?
Maybe.
Maybe, we don't know, right? But the husband is the one who initiates the divorce, and then it puts her in a position where she is going to be an adulteress if she remarries. And of course, in that day, a woman without a husband was a beggar on the street, right? So it puts her in a position where she remarries, and then she becomes an adulteress because of that. So he has put her in a position to be an adulteress by divorcing her. And again, let's look at what it says in verse 9. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, and marries another, so this is the husband, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery, right? So this is what's happened to this woman back in Deuteronomy, right? Because she was married, she was divorced, right, for a reason other than adultery. Then she is put in a position to commit adultery because of that. That sounded a little confusing even when I said it. So we're going to keep talking about this so we can get clarity here. So what are you saying here in verse 9? That there is only, in this passage, there is only one reason that divorce is allowed, is permitted, and that is for adultery. Okay? Because again, in the Old Testament picture, a man who commits adultery should be killed. So he's essentially dead, right? And so he's saying if the adulterer is dead, then yes, that breaks the bond of marriage. Let me back up. I misspoke there. Adultery happens. Adultery in and of itself does not break the bond of marriage. Just because someone has committed adultery, that does not break the bond of marriage. What breaks the bond of marriage is breaking the commitment that we talked about back in verses 1 through 4, right? The commitment of one man, one woman for life. Breaking that commitment, that breaks the marriage. The adultery itself does not break the marriage. Why? Because adultery can be forgiven. Adultery can be forgiven. He has said you have permission to get a divorce if there is adultery, but you're not commanded to get a divorce if there is adultery. That's an important distinction. And we've talked about this before in here. I mean, you know, Joe and I have worked with couples where there has been adultery, where the two have found forgiveness over that adultery, and the two have stayed married, and that marriage has flourished. And then we've also worked with couples where there has been adultery, where there is not forgiveness, and that couple eventually divorces because of that. And as I said before, let me say again because it's so important. When there is adultery, there's two things that have to happen before that couple can come back together. One, there's got to be supernatural forgiveness on behalf of the one, typically the wife, upon which the adultery happens, right? So she has to have supernatural forgiveness. The other thing that has to happen is supernatural brokenness on the part of the one who has committed the adultery. Unless both of those things happen, the two cannot come back together. And we've seen some where there's been forgiveness, but there's been no brokenness. Some where there's been brokenness and no forgiveness, and those two cannot come back together. Without both of those things, the two never can come back together. Well, I'm just saying the two do not come back together as a couple. But in both cases, it's supernatural. That is not something humanly possible to have happened. Now, but he's saying again, let me just repeat one more time. He's saying here, the only reason while God permits a divorce is for adultery, and that's only because of the hardness of your hearts. In other words, because you cannot forgive, or because there is not brokenness, right? Then I will allow a certificate of divorce. So let me just pause there because I've clumsily stated that a couple of times to make sure you got it. Now, if there is adultery and if there is divorce, is remarriage okay? Very quiet.
Not really. Not really.
I didn't hear you.
He said, not really.
And Michelle said no.
So,
It causes adultery.
I'll throw a caveat into it. It is adultery, but God forgives adultery.
Yeah.
God's a forgiver of sin.
Yes.
Where's the brokenness? Is it one-sided?
So, so let me say it this way. If someone commits adultery, a man, let's just say a man and woman, okay, so we can get clear, we're talking about the right person. A man commits adultery against a woman, right? The man never gets to brokenness, right? But the woman gets to forgiveness. The man wants to divorce the wife and divorces the wife, right? In this particular case, there's no sin on the woman's part. She has forgiven him. He has committed the adultery and he has not gone to brokenness. In those cases, that woman can remarry because there's no sin that she has committed. So going back to what we learned in Deuteronomy, if he divorces her for not adultery, right, then she cannot remarry. But if he divorces her for adultery, then she can remarry if she has no sin, i.e. she has forgiven him for the adultery, but he's not willing to come back together as a couple. I'm just going to pause there.
Where do you see that in scripture?
Where do you see that in scripture? Here's what's interesting about this one is there's a bunch of scripture, and I didn't write it all down because I thought this was going to be obvious to you guys. So now I'm going to have to go back. Go to Romans chapter 7. There's a piece of it here. See if you can believe me. Romans chapter 7. Begin at verse 1. Says, or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over man as long as he lives. For a woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if a husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. So then, if while her husband lives, she marries another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she is free from the law, so that she is no adulteress, though she has married another man. Right. So this one I hope is obvious to you, right? So if a man is married and a man and wife are married, and if the husband dies, the wife is free to remarry. Do you agree with that one?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, we got that one. Good. Trying to remember in my head now where the other passages were. It was in Timothy, I think. I'm gonna have to go back and look up. Do what?
She has to marry her husband's brother.
Go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. See if we can pull it out of there. Let me just say one thing right there in Romans. Right. So if a woman's husband dies, she's free to remarry. And the point is, again, as I said a minute ago, if a husband commits adultery, God sees him as dead, right? And therefore the woman is free to remarry, right? Because the punishment for adultery is death. So that's the connection between the two. And unfortunately, I didn't write the scripture down, but go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. First Corinthians chapter 7. Let's begin in verse 10. It says, now to the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, a wife not to depart from her husband. But if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. So Paul here is giving instructions to the Christians who have become Christians after they're married, right? They're married and then they become Christians. And he's saying to them, to the married, I say, a wife is, because you become a Christian, that doesn't give you an excuse to leave your husband. That's what 10 and 11 is about. Verse 12, but to the rest I say, not the Lord, I say, if any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is willing to live with him, let him not divorce her. And if a woman who has a husband who does not believe and is willing to live with her, let her not divorce him. For if the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband, otherwise your children will be unclean, but now they are holy. That's another whole lesson we're not going to get into now. Verse 15, but if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? So here, so Scripture gives 2.5 reasons for why you can get a divorce. One is adultery, right? You're allowed to get a divorce in adultery. Second is, you're allowed to remarry if there has been an adultery. The second is you're allowed to remarry if there's been death, right? As we've seen in Romans. The third one here, the half of one here, is around desertion, right? As we see back in verse 10, if you are both Christians and someone leaves, look at verse 11. But even if she does depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. The husband is not to divorce his wife. So if you are a Christian and your wife leaves, then you are not allowed to remarry. She's not allowed to remarry. Why? Because you're still married, just because you left. But then in verse 15, if one is a believer and one is an unbeliever, if the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. So there are those who take that verse and say, well, what that means is if you're married to an unbeliever and the unbeliever leaves or departs, then you are free to remarry. The only dilemma with that is verse 16, right? Which says, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife, right? How do you know if you don't remarry, whether you can help that one come to a knowledge of who Christ is and bring them back because you have not divorced them in that particular case? So I will say there are churches who utilize that to say, well, we can remarry couples who where there has been someone who has left their husband or left their wife, but it's a caveat.
I have a question.
Yes, go.
Just, you said several times that if the man commits adultery, he is dead to God. A man's law says that he should be stoned until he's dead. So where's the connection there that gives, she can remarry if he's dead? Was that by God's law that he's dead to God, or is that by man's law that he gets stoned? Or both apply and she can go and remarry?
I hear your question.
And they may not be a yes or no in scripture. I just.
Turn to, I think I have found the passage. Turn to 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let's see if this one helps. 1 Timothy chapter 5, look at verse 3. It says, honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety to home and repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable. Now, she who is really a widow and left alone, trusting God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. and these things command that they may be blameless. If anyone does not provide for his own, especially for those of his household, is deny the faith and worse than unbeliever. Verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number. In other words, be cared for by the church, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. Well reported for good works, she has brought up children, la da 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 da. Verse 11, but refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off the first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, etc., etc. Therefore, verse 14, therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity for the adversary. That's not the one I was looking for. That's just the one that says widows should remarry, which we've already said and agreed to. Okay, you're not going to believe me because somebody's asked a question. I'm going to have to find it and come back to you. But there is a passage that does allow those who are divorced to be remarried, and unfortunately, I didn't write it down. So we'll come back to that. Will you allow me to come back to that?
Key point to that in Romans, where it says their death releases them from the law. Isn't that the same as?
It is, but there's a more clearer passage, and unfortunately I didn't write it down. But yes, that is essentially what they're saying, that the death, i.e. the adultery, which is in God's mind death, releases them from the law, and they can therefore remarry. But yeah, I apologize for not being clear there.
If you say it's in there, I believe you. Move on.
Well, so let me just summarize, if you don't mind. Let me summarize. So he is saying here, the point of all of this is that Jesus is saying there is remarriage that's allowed, and that is what Deuteronomy was talking about. Was when it was not allowed. It's not allowed if it's a divorce that's not according to God's law. That the only time remarriage is allowed is when it is according to God's law, which is when there is adultery. And then, of course, if there is death, and then perhaps if there is abandonment, I'll leave that to you guys to decide. I will say that it is also our church's position with regard to remarriage is along these lines, right? Remarriage is only allowed if it is a legal divorce, if it is a divorce according to God's laws. And so when couples come to get married at the church and there has been divorce in the past, there is a conversation about that divorce. What was the point of that divorce? What was the purpose of that divorce? Is it because of adultery, or is it for some other reason? And if it's for some other reason, they are not allowed to get married in this church. So that is the stance that we've taken with regard to that. All right.
I have
Now.
a question. I have a
Go ahead.
question.
Yeah.
So just to follow up with your example, say the man commits adultery and he is broken, but the wife can't forgive him. And I'm not saying this for personal reasons. Then can she still remarry, like in God's eye, if he was broken and wanted to be forgiven, but she just couldn't do it?
That's an interesting example. Let me tell you this. This happened years ago. There was a couple who were involved in adultery. Neither of them got it right. He was not broken. She could not forgive. And then a couple of years later, she applied to serve in the church, to be on staff. And I was called by the staff to say, "Hey, you dealt with this couple. Should we bring her on the church staff?" And my answer was no. This woman, although she did not commit the adultery, she never got to the point of forgiveness. She had bitterness. She could not forgive, and I don't believe you want someone like that on staff, right? So it's not exactly answering your question, but the point is that woman is still in sin. Can she remarry or not? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, to be honest with you. But the point is that she's still in sin, right? Because she has bitterness and she has not forgiven because of that thing that has happened to her, that sin that has occurred, to her. She is not able to get past that sin.
Rich, how do you know she hadn't forgiven him? I mean, are you saying if you forgive them, that means you have to remain in the marriage? That's the only proof of forgiveness?
No, I didn't say that at all. I just said that, I said in this particular case, we were having interactions with this woman and tried to help her forgive in this situation, and she would not. That's all I'm saying there. So it was very clear to us that she was not forgiving, that she had bitterness and was holding on to it. It's not something we get. And we're not saying she had to go back in that relationship. No, I wasn't saying that at all.
I got it.
It's late.
Oh, yeah, it's really late. So we will, I'll come back and find that other scripture, and then we'll deal with 10 through 12 next time. Obviously,
Can
this
I-
is a, yeah.
More questions for next week? I'm struggling between the determination between death and dead to God. You know,
That's not saying. You just say.
All right, let me think on that. I understand, the tension there. Let me think on that and make sure I'm more clearer next time. I knew this would be interesting. Of course, I knew it would turn left somewhere. Of course, it always turns left in a place I'm not sure and not expecting. So I apologize for that. So let's go on to prayer requests because it's late. Joe, from us?
We're keeping 10-month-old Jackson Thursday through Sunday just to give him a break. And so appreciate your prayers that he stays well and safe.
All right, in the room there, Hugh.
Okay, we'll just start from the back. With the
Yeah,
Cecil's.
continue prayers for Terry's parents. Yeah, 5 months there, yeah. Every day struggles and hit with the mom.
I don't know where we're at. Sorry, I was right.
They were good.
Sorry.
The bulls are well, thank you.
Nothing new from the Moors, same as usual.
I would just ask for prayer for my sister Pam, who announced to the family this week that they are getting a divorce after 38 years of marriage, but there's been questions for many years. And that her answer was, she didn't go into anything other than he's not the man of integrity that I fell in love with and have been married to. So just pray for them. She's beating herself up for his behavior. And then my brother Steve has a date for his surgery of the 27th. And Tim talked for a while this week.
Oh, stop the recording.
Just keep us in your prayers. Susie's upcoming surgery.